filming tiger sharks in open water about 200 miles out of the Grand Bahama. We're at the edge of a large flat plain of reef and sand, about 40 feet deep, looking out over the abyss where the bottom drops into the deep Atlantic. The boat that I was diving from uses a chum to dump blood and ground up fish overboard to attract sharks from the open ocean. We had two 14 to 6 foot female tigers who would come up over the ledge and swim very slowly through our group of divers before circling back out into the blue. After about an hour of filming, all of the other divers in my group had run low on air and descended. I have always been pretty efficient on gas and still had plenty of bottom time left, so I spent a bit longer on the bottom, hoping for some clean shots of the tigers. Within a few minutes, the current shifted and began picking up the fine white sand from the shelf, and the water became like milk. Visibility went from well over 100 feet to less than 10 very quickly. I decided to bag it and to head back to the boat. The problem was I could no longer see where the boat was floating on the surface, and the shot line that was hung below it for divers to use on their ascent was also nowhere in sight. I ended up doing a reference-free ascent in whiteout visibility. The current that had shifted was now pushing from the shelf out into the open ocean, and it quickly carried me out of sight of the bottom and away from where the boat was anchored. I always carry a signal float on a reel, and I sent it to the surface to mark my position and give me some sort of reference to ascend with. As I was hanging in mid-water with absolutely no visual reference, save for the spool of line in my hand disappearing into the cloudy water above me, I could see the shadows of the tiger sharks following me into the open ocean at the very edge of visibility. Due to the amount of time I had been at depth, I was obligated to hold position at 15 feet for 3 minutes to allow my body to off-gas nitrogen to avoid getting the bends. During that time, these truck-sized predators circled back to me again and again from every side and angle. I was spinning in the water, trying to see in every direction at once. I would catch a glimpse of a shadow moving, and at the last second, when it was mere feet from me, and would turn just in time to deflect it away from me. The truly terrifying thing was just how slow and insidious they were about it. You know, the way a large dog will sometimes just kind of lazily push into you. That's what these massive tiger sharks were doing. They would circle out into the gloom, out of sight, and then lazily swim direct at me without a care in the world as to whether or not I would move or react. Each time I had to reach out and push myself off to the side, off their 3 feet wide heads. Then, they would just flinch away at my touch before sliding off into the darkness, only to return a few seconds later from a completely different direction. The worst part was once I reached the surface and saw how far from the boat was. It took me 10 minutes swimming against the current to get back to the boat, knowing the whole time I was right in the middle of a miles-long patch of fish blood and chum being dumped over the railing and drifting with the current right to me. I didn't see the tigers at the surface, but it's far more nerve-wracking. I knew they were still right below me, and I swam with my face in the water, still trying to see in every direction at once. We changed locations after that dive in search of better visibility, but I sat out the rest of the day with my nerves completely fried. When I went and got my first major job as a forensic death investigator, it happened to be at the same time that our county was putting together a new division of search and rescue. They needed people who were certified scuba divers that had some experience. Being the new kid at the time, about 24 years old, they called me the puppy. I kinda got talked into becoming one of the on-call divers. We did a few practice dives, and I ended up responding to a few search and rescue orders. Most were looking for lost fishermen that went out in a storm condition, searching a lake for missing people, after boating accidents. You know, stuff like that. The waters in Texas are murky and house all sorts of awesome creatures. We had an issue where some young guy, about my age, had gone out kayaking the major river in my city during a storm and nobody had heard from him. We went to the last place somebody saw him and started our standard search. For some reason, I wasn't too keen to enter the water that day and was triple checking everything. Recoveries weren't exactly my favorite thing to do. I learned scuba mainly for fun, but work changed that. After I go down with another diver, we start our search and shake off my nerves. But towards the end of our dive, I start feeling like a swimmer in the movie Jaws. My heart feels like it's pounding into my chest, and my stomach feels tight, and I'm gonna throw up. I try to calm down and check over my gear while listening to my buddy and the guys on the boat talking, waiting to tell them I'm going to surface a bit early. As I turn to see where my buddy is, a huge alligator gar swims right between us. The ugly mug on the fish scared the hell out of me, and I screamed, probably scaring everybody else in the process. I headed back to the boat as fast as safety would allow. So this happened on one of my very first dives ever. It was possibly the second or third time. Anyway, it was me, 2 other divers, and an instructor. And at this point, we were about 70 feet down, if I'm remembering correctly. We had just landed on a small oceanic shelf that contained some reef and some small fish life. We hadn't been down there for more than maybe 10 minutes when I'm the one out of everybody else while they were exploring saw what I can describe as a giant leech-looking like creature. I mean, if you've ever seen a leech, this was that, but it was the size of my torso and it was hanging on the side of the reef. I pulled another diver over to where I was, and he was astounded by the size of this thing. Even the instructor came over and saw it. He said he has never seen anything like it before, and maybe that we should get samples, although we weren't equipped to do that, nor did we have any equipment for that. I had to be extra careful poking around where I was though, because my instructor informed me that there were really large eels hanging around the holes right where I was looking, and that's right where this massive leech was. So I didn't really go poking around too much, but I'm sure there was more of them. Like I said, this thing was easily the size of my torso, and maybe it wasn't a leech because I didn't try to pull it off the reef, but it looked massive. Crazy enough, it was actually that same diving trip that one of the other divers, who I think it was his first time, was more of a novice than me, actually got bit pretty severe by a much larger eel than any of us have ever seen. It came out from one of the holes in the reefs, ones that we didn't happen to even notice that were near the bottom. He must have been diving away from me and over a small section of reef when it came out and probably felt threatened by his presence. It struck his thigh pretty good. I mean, this thing was huge. Even our instructor said he was impressed by the size of this eel. Anyway, that's all for my crazy sea creature stories. Oh, and before I forget to mention, this was in Southern California, right near the border of Mexico, actually. In fact, that's right where they supposedly found other extremely large sharks swimming around the area. So I guess what we were doing at the time was pretty risky, considering the current wasn't the best, and visibility wasn't perfect. But it was okay, especially for the time of day we went. One last thing I wanted to include. I wouldn't learn this till a few months after this dive, but I guess only a couple of miles away from where we dove at, there was a few people that had actually gotten attacked by a large great white shark, or something along those lines. Maybe it was a tiger shark. I don't quite remember. I just know that there was a very near fatal shark attack that happened right around that area, which I said is pretty risky in its own right. I've gone diving dozens of times since then, and unfortunately, I haven't had anything too exciting, like seeing anything crazy, having any near-death experiences, and no, I have not yet been attacked by a shark. I'm pretty safe and smart about who I dive with and how I dive. I'd say the worst thing, or the scariest thing, is when you dive with somebody who's much more inexperienced than you, and they make a fatal mistake that costs you not only your life, but your entire group's life. That's what you gotta look out for. Or getting stuck with a newbie who doesn't quite realize that they can't ascend to the surface just as is, that they have to do compression stops. I've seen a couple times where newbies have gotten the bends and luckily didn't die, but almost did.